In the cold winter of 1135, England did not fall with swords or fire. It slipped into chaos quietly. There were no invading armies, no cities ablaze, only a king dying far from home and a crown suddenly without an heir. Whispers spread faster than the wind. Oaths once sworn were questioned. Powerful men moved in the shadows. Horses were saddled in darkness. Ships braved stormy seas across the channel. What followed was not a single battle but 19 years of turmoil. Castles sprang up without permission. Justice vanished. Loyalty became a currency to be bought and sold. Chroniclers would later search for words. One wrote simply, "Christ and his saints slept." This is the story of King Stephen, not a conqueror, not a tyrant, but a man whose reign exposed the fragility of a kingdom when authority failed. To understand him, we must first understand the world unraveling around him. England in the early 12th century was still an experiment. Less than 70 years earlier, it had been conquered by William of Normandy. Since then, England had not truly become English again. The ruling class spoke French. Law followed Norman custom. Power flowed through personal loyalty, not stable institutions. The king was the system. If the king was strong, the kingdom held together. If he was weak, everything unraveled. There was no professional army, no national bureaucracy. Royal authority depended on presence, reputation, and fear. This meant succession mattered more than anything else. A disputed inheritance did not mean debate. It meant violence. England had survived one such crisis before. It would not survive the next one intact. At the center of this fragile balance stood King Henry I, brilliant, calculating, and utterly aware that one mistake could destroy everything his father had built. Henry I ruled longer than any Norman king before him. He was intelligent, ruthless when necessary, and deeply suspicious of his nobles. But Henry carried a fear that never left him. He had no legitimate son. In 1120, his only lawful male heir drowned in a catastrophe remembered as the White Ship disaster. The ship struck a rock in the dark waters of the Channel. Almost everyone aboard died. Henry survived, but his dynasty did not. Without a male heir, England faced a future no one trusted. Henry remarried, hoping for another son. None came. Instead, he made a decision that challenged every assumption of medieval rule. He named his daughter Matilda as his successor. To modern ears, this may sound reasonable. In the 12th century, it was explosive. Matilda was no ordinary princess. She had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor and addressed as Empress. She was educated, proud, and politically experienced. She was also a woman. In medieval England, a woman ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. Nobles feared instability. Church leaders worried about precedent. Barons questioned whether they would obey her commands. Henry forced his court to swear oaths to support Matilda. Again and again, he demanded loyalty. Many complied. Few believed the moment would ever come. Even Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, a popular nobleman and a man close to the throne, swore the oath. What mattered was not the oath itself, but what would happen when Henry was gone. Because oaths are easy to swear. They are harder to keep. Henry I died in December 1135 in Normandy. There was no dramatic announcement. No great council summoned in advance. Just a body cooling far from England. The moment news began to travel, England entered a race, not of armies but of speed. Matilda was in Anjou, pregnant and politically isolated. Many nobles hesitated, unsure whether to act. Stephen did not hesitate. He understood something crucial. Legitimacy mattered less than momentum. If he could reach England first, secure London, and be crowned quickly, the crown might become his before anyone could object. History often turns on moments like this. Quiet decisions, rapid movement, and the willingness to act while others pause. Stephen of Blois was not an obvious usurper. He was known as generous, charming, and personally brave. He fought alongside his men and inspired loyalty. But Stephen lacked one thing every successful medieval king needed: decisiveness. He preferred compromise over punishment, forgiveness over fear. In peaceful times, this would have made him beloved. In a succession crisis, it would destroy him. Stephen crossed the Channel in winter storms. He moved quickly, secured support from London, and gained the backing of the church by promising reform. Within weeks, he was crowned King of England. It was not entirely legal. It was not entirely accepted. But it was done. Stephen's kingship rested on promises. He promised the church freedom. He promised barons lands and castles. He promised stability to a fearful kingdom. But every promise weakened the crown. Castles were the key to power in medieval England. By allowing nobles to build them freely, Stephen surrendered control. Each castle became a private fortress. Each baron, a small king. Stephen wanted peace. Instead, he legalized fragmentation. At first, England seemed calm. Rebellions were small, resistance was scattered, but beneath the surface, loyalty was dissolving. Men began to test the king, and Stephen failed the test. Matilda did not rush to England. She watched. She listened. She allowed Stephen to make mistakes. From France, she gathered allies. Powerful nobles who believed Stephen's authority was thin. Churchmen who doubted his promises. Her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, harassed Norman lands, stretching Stephen's attention. This was not inactivity. It was patience. Stephen ruled, but Matilda prepared. England was drifting toward war slowly, quietly, like a ship losing its anchor. By the late 1130s, England was no longer whole. Rebellions flared in Wales. The North resisted royal authority. Barons switched sides with ease. Stephen moved constantly, chasing unrest. But movement is not control. Each time he forgave a rebel, others learned rebellion was safe. Each time he compromised, authority weakened. Royal justice slowed. Coinage declined. Law became local. For ordinary people, life became uncertain. Protection depended on whichever lord controlled the nearest castle. The kingdom still had a king, but it no longer felt ruled. The church was meant to be Stephen's strongest ally. Instead, it became another source of instability. Stephen arrested bishops suspected of rebellion, violating sacred norms. This shocked church leaders and damaged his legitimacy. Once again, Stephen acted too late and too gently, releasing prisoners and apologizing. To medieval society, this was disastrous. A king who challenged the church and then retreated appeared weak to everyone. Stephen was losing the moral authority that sustained kingship, and Matilda's supporters noticed. There was no moment when civil war officially began. It crept in. A castle seized here, a lord defecting there, a region quietly ignoring royal orders. By the time armies openly clashed, England was already broken. This was not a war of banners and grand speeches. It was a war of attrition, fought through sieges, betrayals, and exhaustion. Stephen was king in name, but England was no longer his. In 1139, Matilda finally crossed into England. It was not a grand invasion, no massive fleet, no dramatic landing. She arrived quietly, with limited forces, relying on allies rather than armies. Her power base formed around the west of England, where resentment toward Stephen was strongest. Matilda did not claim the crown immediately. Instead, she claimed legitimacy. She reminded nobles of their oaths. She presented herself not as a conqueror, but as the rightful ruler returning home. Stephen reacted slowly. By the time he marched against her, Matilda's position had hardened. Castles declared for her cause. Barons hedged their bets, offering loyalty to both sides. England now had two rulers and no authority strong enough to silence the other. The Civil War had become undeniable. This was not a war of sweeping battles. It was a war of castles. Castles dominated roads, towns, and farmland. Whoever controlled them controlled survival. Siege warfare replaced open combat. Stephen lacked the resources to destroy rebel strongholds quickly. Instead, sieges dragged on for months. During this time, local populations suffered most. Crops were seized, villages abandoned, law vanished. Every siege weakened royal authority further. Stephen fought constantly, but always reactively. He never struck a decisive blow. The war became exhausting rather than dramatic, and exhaustion favors those willing to wait. As the war continued, England's nobility learned a dangerous lesson. Loyalty was optional. Barons changed sides freely, negotiating better terms with each shift. Castles became bargaining chips. Titles were traded like currency. Stephen rewarded loyalty with land, then forgave betrayal when it suited him. This destroyed the meaning of allegiance. Kingship became transactional. Once that happened, Stephen no longer ruled men. He negotiated with them. And negotiation is not power. One of Stephen's greatest strengths was not Stephen himself. It was his wife. Queen Matilda of Boulogne was decisive, intelligent, and relentless. When Stephen hesitated, she acted. She raised armies. secured alliances, protected royal territory. In many ways, she was the backbone of Stephen's reign. Without her, his rule might have collapsed years earlier, but even her strength could not fix a broken system. She could win battles. She could not restore authority. By 1141, the war reached a breaking point. Stephen marched north toward Lincoln to confront a coalition supporting Matilda. Advisors urged caution. Stephen ignored them. This decision would define his reign. The battlefield was narrow and muddy. Stephen dismounted to fight alongside his men, a gesture of courage and desperation. It would cost him everything. The Battle of Lincoln was chaotic and brutal. Stephen fought fiercely. His horse was killed beneath him. He continued on foot, refusing to retreat. Eventually, he was surrounded. The King of England was captured. For the first time since the Norman conquest, the crown had no wearer. Stephen was imprisoned. England entered its darkest moment. With Stephen imprisoned, Matilda stood on the edge of victory. She entered London. She was declared Lady of the English. But she was not crowned. Matilda demanded authority, not compromise. She underestimated how fragile support still was. London turned against her. Opportunity slipped away. Queen Matilda of Boulogne refused to surrender. She gathered forces, rallied allies, and surrounded London. Matilda, the would-be queen, was forced to flee. Stephen's cause lived on. Stephen was eventually released. The war resumed. Nothing was resolved. Both sides had tasted victory and failure. England remained trapped between them. By the mid-1140s, England was exhausted. There was no final battle in sight, only years of slow decay. This was no longer a war for the crown. It was a war for survival. By the late 1140s, England no longer functioned as a kingdom. Royal courts barely operated. Sheriffs answered to whoever controlled the nearest fortress. Laws varied from valley to valley. Justice became personal. If a lord was strong, his lands were safe. If he was weak, they were raided, taxed, or seized. Ordinary people learned to survive by silence, not loyalty. Chroniclers described villages abandoned and fields left unplanted. Trade slowed. Roads became dangerous. This was not constant violence, and that made it worse. Long stretches of fear were punctuated by sudden destruction. Stephen was still king, still issuing orders, still traveling endlessly. But the machinery of government no longer responded. England had entered a rare state in medieval history. Not tyranny, not conquest, but absence. A kingdom where no one truly ruled. Castles were meant to protect the realm. During Stephen's reign, they consumed it. Thousands of unauthorized castles appeared, wooden fortifications, stone keeps, fortified manors. Each one controlled nearby land, roads, and people. These were not royal castles. They were private states. Lords collected their own taxes, raised their own troops, enforced their own justice. Some even minted their own coins. Stephen could not tear them down fast enough. Each attempt sparked resistance. The king no longer decided where power lived. Stone did. This was the true legacy of the anarchy. Authority became architectural. Whoever owned the strongest walls ruled. The Civil War was fought by nobles, but it was paid for by everyone else. Peasants lost crops to armies that did not protect them. Merchants paid tolls to half a dozen lords on a single journey. Families fled lands they had worked for generations. There was no side to choose. Stephen's banners and Matilda's banners brought the same result. Food seized, animals taken, sons conscripted. Later generations would romanticize medieval warfare. Those who lived through it did not. For them, the war was hunger, fear, and uncertainty stretched across years. And the king, once seen as protector, became distant and irrelevant. Stephen aged rapidly during the war. He was constantly on campaign, constantly negotiating, constantly forgiving betrayal to prevent worse betrayal. His energy faded. His decisions became cautious. He still fought, but without vision. The war had stripped him of initiative. He reacted instead of commanding. Most dangerous of all, Stephen began to lose hope that the kingdom could be restored. A king who doubts his own crown invites others to imagine a future without him. That future was already forming. While Stephen struggled to hold England together, a new figure was coming of age across the channel. Matilda's son, Henry. He watched England's collapse carefully. He learned from Stephen's mistakes, the danger of mercy, the cost of hesitation. Unlike Stephen, Henry would not seek compromise first. The war was not over. But its outcome was beginning to take shape. By the early 1150s, England felt frozen, not at peace, not fully at war. The fighting had slowed, but the damage continued. Lords had settled into their territories, ruling them like permanent possessions. Few expected a decisive victory anymore. Stephen still moved across the kingdom, but his presence no longer changed outcomes. Castles remained in rebel hands. Alliances shifted quietly. This was a dangerous moment when chaos becomes normal. A generation had grown up knowing nothing else. To them, a divided England was not a crisis. It was reality. Kingship had lost its meaning, and once people stop believing in a crown, restoring it becomes nearly impossible. Justice had once been the king's most powerful tool. Under Stephen, it faded. Royal courts rarely met. Sheriffs acted independently. Disputes were settled by force rather than law. This shift changed how people viewed authority. The king no longer guaranteed fairness. He was just another powerful lord, sometimes stronger, often not. Once justice collapsed, loyalty followed. Stephen understood this, but he lacked the strength to reverse it. To reassert royal law would have required mass punishment, castle destruction, and bloodshed. Stephen could not bring himself to do it. His restraint, once admirable, now prolonged the crisis. By now, the original reason for the war was fading. Few still fought for Matilda's claim. Fewer still for Stephen's right to rule. The war continued because stopping it felt risky. Barons feared losing power in peace. Soldiers feared unemployment. Local rulers feared judgment for past crimes. Chaos had created interests that depended on chaos. This is how civil wars sustain themselves, not through ideology but habit. Stephen sensed this truth, and it left him with no path to victory. Stephen had one remaining hope: succession. If he could secure the throne for his son, the war might end. But fate intervened again. Stephen's heir died unexpectedly. With him died the future Stephen had fought for. The king did not announce defeat, but something broke. Without an heir, Stephen was no longer defending a dynasty, only his own exhausted reign. For the first time, compromise became possible. Peace did not arrive as a treaty at first. It arrived as a thought, a realization shared quietly among exhausted men. The war had no winner. Stephen remained king. Matilda remained defiant, but neither could finish the struggle. In that space, a new solution began to form, one that did not involve victory but succession. And that solution had a name. Henry did not arrive in England as a boy seeking revenge. He arrived as a strategist. By the early 1150s, Henry of Anjou had inherited not only his mother's claim, but her patience. He had watched England's collapse from across the Channel and understood what had gone wrong. Stephen had tried to rule through compromise. Henry would rule through certainty. Henry's first campaigns were cautious. He did not rush to battle Stephen. Instead, he tested loyalty, gathered support, and observed who still mattered. Unlike his mother, Henry did not demand immediate recognition. He let his presence speak. Barons noticed the difference. For the first time in years, England sensed momentum, not toward chaos but toward resolution. Henry's appeal was not ideological. It was practical. He promised order, not revenge. Stability, not punishment. Many nobles who had grown rich in chaos now feared it. Castles were expensive to maintain. Private wars drained resources. Henry offered something rare: a future. He spoke the language of authority, clearly, directly, without apology. Compared to Stephen's exhaustion, Henry looked inevitable. Support shifted quietly, not through declarations but through silence. Stephen still wore the crown, but the future was no longer his. Stephen and Henry eventually met. There was no great battle between them, no final duel to decide the kingdom. Both men understood the truth. Another war would destroy what little remained. Stephen saw in Henry what he could never be: young, decisive, and feared. Henry saw in Stephen a warning. The meeting was tense, respectful, and final. England would not be won by force. It would be inherited. Negotiations followed. They were not simple. Stephen would remain king for life. Henry would be named heir. Stephen's surviving son would be passed over, a painful but necessary decision. This was not victory. It was surrender shaped as peace. But England accepted it gladly. After nearly 2 decades of instability, even an imperfect solution felt miraculous. The war did not end with celebration. It ended with relief. The fighting slowed. Castles stood down. Armies dispersed. No single moment marked the end. The anarchy simply stopped. Stephen remained king, but power no longer mattered. The future had been decided. England exhaled. For the first time in a generation, there was a tomorrow worth believing in. After the agreement with Henry, Stephen was king in title, not in purpose. The crown remained on his head, but the future no longer belonged to him. His authority narrowed to maintenance rather than command. Stephen no longer traveled constantly. He no longer chased rebels or negotiated new loyalties. The war had drained him, and now there was nothing left to defend. For the first time in years, England was calm, not because Stephen ruled it, but because no one wanted to fight anymore. This was the quietest period of Stephen's reign, and in many ways the most honest. He was a king who had outlived his moment. England entered a strange pause. No one challenged Stephen. No one tested Henry. Power hovered between them, suspended. Barons adjusted carefully. Castles were maintained but not expanded. Justice tentatively returned. People waited. For the first time in decades, waiting felt safe. Stephen's reign was effectively over, but his death had not yet come. The kingdom held its breath. Stephen died in October 1154. There was no dramatic end, no final speech. He passed quietly, having ruled longer than most expected and accomplished less than he hoped. His death did not cause chaos. That alone marked the end of an era. The crown passed smoothly to Henry, just as agreed. After 19 years, England finally had a king again. Henry became king without resistance. No battles. No rival claims. The very thing Stephen could never achieve, a peaceful succession, defined his successor's rise. Henry inherited a kingdom in ruin, but with one priceless advantage: acceptance. England wanted him. That desire alone made him powerful. Stephen's reign ended not with judgment but with contrast. What followed would make his failures clear. Henry would rebuild, centralize, punish. The age of compromise was over. Stephen became a dividing line in English history, the example of what happens when authority collapses. And England would remember the lesson. When Henry II became king, he did not celebrate for long. The kingdom he inherited was exhausted, fragmented, and suspicious of authority. Castles still dotted the landscape like scars. Local lords still acted independently. Henry did not rush to punish. First, he observed. He traveled widely, listening, measuring loyalty, identifying which men could be trusted and which could not. This was a deliberate contrast to Stephen. Where Stephen reacted emotionally, Henry calculated patiently. He understood that rebuilding England required more than force. It required legitimacy reinforced by action. The damage done during Stephen's reign could not be undone overnight, but it could be undone systematically. Henry's first decisive act shocked the nobility. He ordered the destruction of unauthorized castles, not negotiations, not compromise, demolition. Castles that had symbolized independence under Stephen were torn down. Some surrendered peacefully, others resisted and paid the price. This sent a clear message. The age of private kingdoms was over. For the first time in decades, power flowed in one direction again, from the crown outward. Stephen had allowed castles to multiply. Henry erased them. Authority returned not through speeches but through stone collapsing into dust. With castles controlled, Henry moved to law. Royal courts were restored. Judges traveled the kingdom. Legal customs were standardized. This was revolutionary. Justice was no longer local. It was royal. For common people, this meant something radical: protection. For nobles, it meant limits. Henry's justice was harsh but predictable, and predictability is power. Stephen had lost the courts. Henry reclaimed them. The kingdom began to function again. Stephen and Henry faced similar challenges. Only one overcame them. Stephen believed mercy would inspire loyalty. Henry believed certainty would enforce it. Stephen forgave betrayal. Henry punished it. Neither approach was moral or immoral, but only one worked in medieval England. Stephen ruled like a peacemaker in a violent age. Henry ruled like a king. History judged the results, not the intentions. With Henry's success, Stephen's reign took on new meaning. He was no longer just a failed king. He became a lesson, a demonstration of what happens when authority weakens and how quickly order can dissolve. Stephen did not destroy England, but his reign revealed how fragile it truly was, and that revelation reshaped the monarchy forever. By the late 1150s, England was finally stabilizing. but the scars of Stephen's reign remained. Villages abandoned during the Civil War were slowly repopulated, roads repaired, castles torn down or reinforced. The crown reclaimed authority, yet memories lingered. Peasants remembered years without protection. Nobles remembered how easily loyalty could be bought or abandoned. Stephen's mistakes had left England wary, cautious, and skeptical of power. Henry understood this as he walked the same roads Stephen had once traveled tirelessly. He knew that restoration required more than armies. It required a psychological shift. The kingdom had to believe in authority again. Stephen had taught Henry exactly what not to do by example, and Henry would make sure England never forgot. One of Henry's first priorities was centralization. Under Stephen, power had diffused to dozens of private lords. Law, taxation, and military authority were fragmented. Henry's solution was structural. Sheriffs answered directly to the crown, taxes flowed upward consistently, and castles were strictly regulated. Stephen's failure made this lesson clear. Without a strong center, the kingdom collapses. Where Stephen had negotiated endlessly, Henry enforced decisively. Rebellious barons were punished or stripped of lands. Loyalty was no longer optional. The anarchy had left a blueprint for governance. See what breaks, then fix it systematically. Stephen had failed to enforce authority. Henry enforced it ruthlessly and efficiently. Royal justice returned, and with it, predictability. Judges traveled the kingdom. Laws were written and enforced uniformly. Local disputes no longer relied on who could raise the most troops. Stephen had allowed justice to fragment. Henry restored it. For the common people, this meant protection from predatory barons. For the nobility, it meant limits on power. The contrast was dramatic. Stephen had believed in compromise to maintain loyalty. Henry believed in consequences to maintain order. England, after decades of chaos, now understood the value of a strong crown and feared what happens when it falters. Stephen's mistakes were not forgotten. They became lessons embedded in English governance. Beyond law and castles, Henry rebuilt England socially and administratively. Markets reopened, trade routes restored, monasteries returned to prosperity. Stephen's reign had fragmented the country, but it also revealed weak points: how money, loyalty, and justice could be systematized. Henry repaired each system, slowly and deliberately. Roads, bridges, and trade centers became the veins of a kingdom ready to function again. What Stephen had broken, Henry made strong. And in doing so, the monarchy became more durable than ever before. England learned from failure, and Stephen's legacy, unintended as it was, became the foundation for long-term stability. Stephen's reign was remembered as chaotic, indecisive, and flawed. Yet paradoxically, it shaped the England that followed. By exposing the fragility of authority, Stephen taught his successors what they must do to maintain it. His failures became lessons: enforce loyalty, centralize power, control castles, and make justice predictable. Stephen himself became a cautionary tale. Henry's triumph was built on Stephen's mistakes. And for the people of England, those 19 years of instability left a lasting impression. Kingship was neither symbolic nor ceremonial. It demanded action, decisiveness, and presence. In short, Stephen's reign would echo far beyond his death, not as glory but as a warning. Henry II's coronation marked a new beginning. Unlike Stephen's rise, it was undisputed. Nobles swore allegiance openly. The church blessed his reign. Even distant regions, fractured during the anarchy, acknowledged the crown without resistance. Henry understood the symbolism. A public, organized ceremony reassured both the powerful and the common people. Authority had returned. For England, this was not merely ceremonial. It was psychological. After 19 years of civil war, seeing a single king recognized by all was revolutionary. Henry's presence represented stability. Where Stephen had failed to inspire respect, Henry commanded it by intention, not luck. The lesson of Stephen's reign was clear. Legitimacy alone is not enough. Authority must be visible, recognized, and enforced. Henry's next challenge was loyalty. Stephen had tolerated betrayal, creating habits that undermined kingship. Barons had grown accustomed to acting independently. Henry did not negotiate with indecision. He rebuilt loyalty carefully. Rewards for obedience, punishment for rebellion, and a clear hierarchy of authority. He allowed some nobles to retain lands if they pledged lasting loyalty, while stripping power from others who had abused Stephen's leniency. This method was subtle yet effective. Unlike Stephen's reactive style, Henry's approach combined incentive with discipline. England slowly reoriented around the crown. The kingdom that had fractured into dozens of mini-states under Stephen was consolidating again. Power once fragmented now flowed from a single recognized center, Henry II. The courts had been in chaos under Stephen. Henry brought predictability. Judges traveled, enforcing laws consistently. Local disputes were no longer decided by who had the largest force. They were decided by the crown's authority. Stephen's inaction had taught the country the cost of fragmented justice. Law was ignored, oppression prevailed, and violence thrived. Henry reversed this. He combined central oversight with local enforcement, ensuring every corner of England answered to royal justice. For ordinary people, this restored security. Markets functioned, villages stabilized, and trade resumed. For nobles, the message was clear. The king's authority mattered, and defiance had consequences. Stephen had failed to assert the power of law. Henry re-established it decisively. Stephen's reign had left England economically fractured. Farms were abandoned, trade routes unsafe, and local taxation inconsistent. Castles drained wealth rather than producing it. Henry rebuilt the economic system systematically. Roads were repaired, bridges restored, markets reopened. Trade returned to both domestic and foreign routes. Standardized taxation created predictability for nobles and merchants alike. Unlike under Stephen, who negotiated endlessly and inconsistently, Henry ensured a stable revenue flow to fund royal authority and defense. The result was a kingdom with both restored order and renewed wealth, a kingdom that could finally sustain itself after decades of instability. Stephen's failures inadvertently laid bare the weaknesses that Henry now exploited to create a more resilient, centralized England. By the mid-1150s, the full lesson of Stephen's reign was clear. Authority is fragile. Loyalty can be bought, abandoned, or ignored. Without enforcement, kingdoms crumble. Stephen had ruled with compromise and mercy. It had won him temporary peace but allowed England to fragment, law to collapse, and people to suffer. Henry ruled with decisiveness. He punished betrayal, centralized power, and enforced law. Stephen's reign was not forgotten. It became the blueprint of what not to do. The kingdom remembered, and Henry acted accordingly. Stephen's 19 years of mismanagement shaped England's future more than his victories or failures. He showed the dangers of indecision and highlighted the necessity of a strong crown. His legacy was paradoxical, failure that guided success. Henry II understood that symbolic authority was not enough. He needed enforcement. Where Stephen had hesitated, Henry acted. Disloyal barons were summoned, judged, and, if necessary, stripped of lands. Castles that had been private fortresses were either demolished or brought under royal command. This was not brutality for its own sake. It was precision, a clear statement. The crown's will was absolute. Ordinary people began to notice the difference. Roads became safer. Trade resumed. Peasants could farm without fear of marauders. England was not merely surviving, it was being rebuilt. Stephen's reign had shown what happens when a king tolerates compromise. Henry ensured those lessons would not be forgotten. Authority would be visible, predictable, and enforceable. One of Henry's key reforms was financial. Stephen had relied on negotiation and favors, leaving taxation inconsistent. Some barons overcollected. Others ignored royal requests. Royal revenue was unreliable, and the crown struggled to fund armies or administrative functions. Henry implemented standard taxation, predictable and enforceable. Every region knew what it owed and when. Failure to comply carried consequences, but compliance was rewarded. This had a double effect. It stabilized the economy and reinforced the authority of the crown. Nobles and merchants alike realized that loyalty to the king was now intertwined with their own prosperity. Stephen's failure to systematize finances had prolonged the anarchy. Henry turned that failure into a roadmap for centralization, ensuring the monarchy could sustain power for generations. Henry also rebuilt the military. Stephen had relied on nobles to raise troops at will. Armies were inconsistent, small, and often loyal to individual lords rather than the king. Siege warfare dragged on, and rebellion spread unchecked. Henry established a more disciplined system. He required regular service from barons, standardized fortifications, and maintained a standing force that could respond to rebellion swiftly. Castles were no longer private fiefdoms. They were tools of royal enforcement. This created both security and deterrence. Nobles understood that rebellion would not be tolerated, and peasant populations could farm, trade, and live without constant threat. Stephen's indecision had created a vacuum. Henry filled it systematically, ensuring that the crown's power extended into every corner of England. Henry also rebuilt relationships with the church. Stephen had alienated clerics at times, arresting bishops and violating church privileges to maintain short-term control. This weakened his legitimacy and encouraged resistance. Henry, by contrast, balanced enforcement with diplomacy. He recognized church authority while ensuring clerical loyalty aligned with the crown. Bishops became partners in governance rather than independent power brokers. This partnership reinforced the centralization of power. The church, previously a source of instability, became a stabilizing force. Stephen's mistakes had demonstrated the cost of alienating religious authority. Henry corrected them methodically. The crown was no longer opposed by one of England's most influential institutions. It now commanded its support. By 1160, England had transformed. Stephen's reign of compromise and indecision had left a kingdom fractured, fearful, and financially unstable. Henry II inherited that legacy and systematically rebuilt every pillar: castles, courts, taxation, army, and church relations. The lessons of the anarchy shaped every decision. Where Stephen had failed, Henry succeeded, not through luck, but through deliberate strategy and enforcement. Authority was visible, predictable, and respected. Ordinary people felt security again. Nobles recognized the crown's supremacy. England's economy recovered. Law returned. Rebellion became risky rather than routine. Stephen's 19 years of chaos became a guide for strengthening monarchy. His mistakes taught Henry precisely what not to do, and in doing so, they ensured England would emerge stronger than before. The anarchy ended, and a new era began. By the early 1160s, Henry II had fully restored royal authority. Stephen's reign had demonstrated how quickly power could fragment when a king hesitated. Nobles acted independently, castles became private states, and the crown had been reduced to a reactive institution. Henry systematically reversed these trends. His presence was felt in every county, every castle, and every courtroom. Orders were followed, taxes collected, and law enforced. The monarchy, once symbolic under Stephen, now commanded tangible power. The psychological impact was profound. England had endured nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, and now, for the first time, people understood that rebellion had consequences and that the crown could enforce them. Stephen's failure had inadvertently shown what was necessary for long-term governance. Henry's reign proved the lesson. Authority must be centralized, visible, and backed by enforcement. Stephen's reign had disrupted law across England. Justice was inconsistent, local lords ruled arbitrarily, and courts were often ignored. Henry rebuilt the legal system from the ground up. Judges traveled regularly, royal courts operated consistently, and laws were standardized. Disputes were now resolved according to the crown, not brute force. This reform had 2 effects. First, it reassured the common people, who could finally rely on protection and predictable outcomes. Second, it reminded the nobility that the king's authority extended over everyone, even the most powerful barons. Stephen had allowed the collapse of justice, revealing its fragility. Henry used that lesson to make law a tool of power rather than a casualty of it. By restoring courts, Henry not only reasserted authority but created stability that would endure for generations. The anarchy had left England's economy in ruins. Fields lay fallow, trade routes were dangerous, and markets were abandoned. Stephen's indecision prolonged economic stagnation. Henry repaired infrastructure. Roads and bridges were rebuilt, towns were revived, and trade routes secured. Taxes became consistent and enforceable, creating predictability for merchants and nobles alike. This reconstruction transformed daily life. Peasants returned to farming, trade resumed, and towns began to flourish. Revenue flowed steadily to the crown, funding administration, defense, and royal projects. Stephen's mistakes had exposed the vulnerabilities of decentralized authority. Henry took those lessons and rebuilt a kingdom that could function efficiently, economically, and administratively. England was no longer a collection of semi-independent fiefdoms. It was a functioning state. Stephen's reign had demonstrated the dangers of a fragmented military. Armies were small, inconsistent, and loyal to lords rather than the crown. Sieges dragged on, rebellions flourished, and security was uncertain. Henry II reorganized the military entirely. Barons were required to provide troops systematically. Castles were placed under direct royal oversight. Standing forces were maintained to respond quickly to unrest. This reform created deterrence. Rebellion became risky. Nobles understood that the king's military power could reach every corner of the kingdom. Ordinary people benefited from increased security. Where Stephen had tolerated disorder, Henry imposed order. The kingdom could now function under the king's authority without the constant threat of internal conflict. Stephen's failures had revealed the consequences of indecision. Henry built a system that made England stronger, safer, and more unified than ever before. By 1165, England had been transformed. Stephen's 19 years of indecision and compromise had nearly destroyed the kingdom, but they also taught invaluable lessons. Authority, law, military power, and economy could no longer be left to chance. Henry II applied these lessons systematically. The monarchy became centralized. Castles were controlled, justice was enforced, the economy stabilized, and the military disciplined. Ordinary people regained security, while nobles understood the limits of their independence. Stephen's legacy, paradoxically, was the blueprint for Henry's success. The failures of one reign directly informed the strategies of the next. England emerged from the anarchy stronger than before, a kingdom capable of sustaining both peace and authority. Stephen's reign, often dismissed as weak, became a crucial turning point in English history. Without it, Henry II's reforms might never have been fully understood or implemented. By 1166, the rule of law was firmly re-established. Stephen's reign had revealed the cost of inconsistent justice, barons enforcing their own will, peasants suffering, and local conflicts spiraling out of control. Henry II addressed this by standardizing courts, sending royal judges across England, and ensuring that decisions were consistent and enforceable. The psychological effect was profound. For the first time in decades, ordinary people could rely on protection. Nobles understood that the king's authority extended into every corner of the realm. Defiance was risky. Obedience brought tangible rewards. Stephen's failures had highlighted what happens when a king hesitates. Henry's decisiveness transformed this lesson into a system. Law was no longer optional. It was the backbone of royal power. England was no longer fractured by competing authorities. It was unified under a predictable and enforceable system. Stephen's reign had devastated infrastructure. Roads were dangerous, bridges were destroyed, and trade had largely collapsed. Henry II systematically repaired what had been broken. Roads and bridges were rebuilt, markets reopened, and towns revived. Trade routes, both domestic and international, were secured, bringing wealth back to the kingdom. Standardized taxation provided predictability. Merchants could plan, peasants could farm, and barons could rely on regular revenue. England's economy recovered faster than many historians had anticipated. Stephen's failures had exposed the fragility of decentralized control. Henry took these lessons and applied them systematically, ensuring that the crown's authority could support both governance and economic stability. The kingdom that had suffered under the anarchy was now stronger, wealthier, and more resilient than ever before. Stephen had allowed the military to fragment. Armies were loyal to barons, not the crown. Sieges were slow and inefficient. Rebellions were common. Henry rebuilt England's military system. Barons were required to provide troops according to strict rules. Castles were placed under direct royal oversight. Standing forces could respond quickly to unrest. The result was deterrence. Nobles understood that rebellion would fail, and ordinary people could live without constant threat. Authority was backed not just by law, but by force that could reach every corner of the kingdom. Stephen's indecision had revealed the dangers of weak enforcement. Henry's reforms transformed England into a state with centralized military power, capable of defending the crown and ensuring domestic stability. Stephen had sometimes clashed with the church, undermining his legitimacy. Bishops and abbots acted independently, sometimes against the crown. Henry II approached the church differently. He recognized its authority while ensuring its loyalty aligned with the monarchy. Bishops became partners in governance, helping enforce law and maintain social order. This partnership reinforced central authority. Religious institutions, previously a source of instability, now supported royal governance. Stephen's mistakes had shown the cost of alienating religious power. Henry turned that lesson into strength. The church became a stabilizing force, bolstering the crown while also benefiting from order and predictability. Authority, law, economy, military, and religion were now intertwined, a kingdom fully structured for long-term governance. By 1170, the anarchy, Stephen's 19-year reign, was fading from immediate memory, but its lessons remained. Stephen had shown the dangers of indecision, compromise, and fragmented authority. The kingdom had suffered. Castles multiplied unchecked, law was ignored, nobles acted independently, and ordinary people endured hunger, fear, and instability. Henry II applied those lessons with precision, transforming England into a centralized, disciplined, and predictable kingdom. Authority was enforceable, law was consistent, castles, taxes, and armies all served the crown. Stephen's failures were not simply forgotten. They were studied, understood, and corrected. The chaos he had allowed became the foundation for a stronger monarchy. Without Stephen's example of what not to do, Henry's reforms might not have been as comprehensive. The anarchy was not just a dark period. It was a turning point that shaped England's future. Stephen's reign had left the monarchy weakened, but Henry II rebuilt it deliberately. Where Stephen had relied on negotiation, Henry relied on authority. Castles were under central control, royal courts functioned consistently, and barons knew the limits of their independence. Law, taxes, and military service were predictable and enforceable. The psychological shift was profound. England's people, exhausted by decades of conflict, finally recognized the crown as a source of stability rather than uncertainty. Nobles aligned themselves carefully with Henry, aware that resistance would be costly. Stephen's failure had created a vacuum of authority. Henry filled it systematically, ensuring that power flowed from the king and nowhere else. England had survived the anarchy, but it had learned a crucial lesson. Kingship required decisiveness, enforcement, and presence. The anarchy had devastated England's economy. Villages were abandoned, markets inactive, and trade routes unsafe. Stephen's indecision allowed local barons to exploit peasants and merchants, creating economic fragmentation. Henry II reversed this. Roads and bridges were repaired, markets reopened, trade routes were secured both domestically and internationally. Standardized taxation provided predictability for nobles and merchants, enabling the economy to function efficiently. Villagers could farm without fear. Merchants could plan long-term. Nobles received consistent revenue. England's wealth began to recover rapidly. Stephen's failures had inadvertently revealed vulnerabilities. A kingdom cannot survive without predictable law, order, and economic infrastructure. Henry's reforms addressed every weakness, creating a system resilient enough to withstand future crises. Stephen's reign had disrupted law across England. Justice was inconsistent, courts were ignored, and barons ruled arbitrarily. Henry restored royal justice. Judges traveled the kingdom regularly, and legal decisions were standardized. Disputes were resolved by the crown, not by local force. For ordinary people, this meant security and predictability. For nobles, it meant limits and consequences. The king's authority was now enforced through law rather than negotiation. Stephen's failures had highlighted the fragility of justice when authority is weak. Henry turned this lesson into strength. The crown became the arbiter of law, ensuring obedience and stability across the realm. England began functioning as a unified state once more, demonstrating that law and authority are inseparable. Stephen's mismanagement had shown the cost of neglect, and Henry's reforms corrected it comprehensively. Stephen had allowed the military to fragment. Armies were small, inconsistent, and loyal to local lords rather than the king. Sieges dragged on. Rebellion was common. Henry rebuilt the military systematically. Barons were required to provide troops predictably. Castles were placed under royal oversight. Standing forces could respond quickly to threats. Rebellion became risky. Nobles understood the limits of their independence. Ordinary people could farm and trade safely. Authority was no longer symbolic, it was enforceable. Stephen's indecision had revealed the consequences of weak enforcement. Henry's reforms transformed England into a state with centralized military power, capable of defending both the crown and domestic stability. The kingdom was no longer a patchwork of private fiefdoms. It was a unified, disciplined, and secure state. By the mid-1160s, the lessons of Stephen's Anarchy had fully influenced English governance. Stephen had shown what happens when a king hesitates. Castles multiply, law collapses, barons act independently, and ordinary people suffer. His reign exposed the fragility of authority and the dangers of compromise in a violent age. Henry II applied these lessons systematically. Authority became enforceable. Justice was consistent. Castles, taxes, armies, and religious institutions all aligned with the crown. Stephen's failures were not merely forgotten. They became a blueprint for stronger monarchy. The chaos of the anarchy forced England to evolve. Stephen's legacy was paradoxical. He failed spectacularly, yet through failure, he taught his successors precisely how to rebuild, reform, and consolidate power. England emerged stronger, more centralized, and more resilient than ever. By the late 1160s, Henry II had fully consolidated royal power. Stephen's reign had left the monarchy weak and uncertain. Authority had fragmented across castles, courts, and local barons. England had learned the cost of indecision. Henry's approach was systematic. Castles were under royal control, courts operated consistently, taxes were predictable, and the military was disciplined. Even the church became a partner in governance. The kingdom functioned as a unified state rather than a collection of semi-independent fiefdoms. Ordinary people could farm, trade, and live without fear. Nobles understood that loyalty was no longer negotiable, it was enforceable. Stephen's failures had created the blueprint. Henry applied it meticulously. Authority was visible, law was consistent, and rebellion was risky. The crown's power was no longer symbolic, it was practical, centralized, and enduring. Stephen's mismanagement had fractured the economy. Trade routes were unsafe, markets inactive, and taxation inconsistent. Henry II rebuilt systematically. Roads and bridges were repaired, towns revived, and markets reopened. Merchants and peasants gained predictability, while taxes became standardized. Wealth flowed steadily to the crown, funding governance, defense, and infrastructure. Economic recovery reinforced political stability. A functioning economy made obedience profitable and rebellion costly. Stephen's failures had exposed weaknesses. Henry addressed them all. The kingdom's wealth allowed Henry to maintain strong military forces, enforce justice, and support the church. Stability bred prosperity, and prosperity reinforced loyalty. In essence, Henry turned Stephen's mistakes into a comprehensive framework for centralized power. The kingdom emerged stronger economically than it had been before the anarchy. Stephen's reign had left law in chaos. Courts were ignored, local barons ruled by force, and ordinary people had no reliable protection. Henry II restored the legal system. Judges traveled the country, decisions were standardized, and royal authority was enforced in every county. Disputes no longer depended on who had the strongest army. This provided security and predictability. Peasants could farm, merchants could trade, and nobles knew the limits of their power. Law became a central tool of governance rather than a casualty of disorder. Stephen's mistakes had revealed the consequences of weak enforcement. Henry's reforms institutionalized justice, ensuring authority was respected across the kingdom. The contrast between the anarchy and Henry's orderly governance could not have been clearer. England had learned that law, consistently applied, is a cornerstone of centralized power. During Stephen's reign, the military was fragmented. Armies answered to local lords, not the king, creating chaos and insecurity. Henry II reorganized it entirely. Barons provided troops predictably, castles were under royal oversight, and standing forces could respond quickly to rebellion or invasion. The result was deterrence. Nobles understood that rebellion was dangerous. Ordinary people experienced peace for the first time in decades. Stephen's indecision had exposed the consequences of weak enforcement. Henry's reforms created a military capable of defending the crown and maintaining domestic order. Authority was no longer symbolic. It was tangible, consistent, and enforceable. This transformation allowed England to emerge from decades of chaos into a unified, secure, and disciplined kingdom. Stephen had sometimes alienated the church, undermining his legitimacy. Bishops and abbots acted independently, occasionally opposing royal authority. Henry II approached the church differently. He recognized its influence while ensuring loyalty aligned with the crown. Bishops became partners in governance, supporting law, taxation, and order. This partnership stabilized the kingdom further. Religious institutions, previously a source of unpredictability, now reinforced the monarchy. Ordinary people saw both spiritual and civil authority aligned, creating trust and obedience. Stephen's failures had shown the cost of alienating the church. Henry's deliberate strategy turned that lesson into strength. Authority, law, economy, military, and religious institutions now worked together in a coordinated system. The anarchy had been destructive, but it had forced the kingdom to evolve. Stephen's reign became a cautionary tale, guiding Henry's reforms and shaping England for generations. The anarchy left more than castles in ruin. It left a memory. Ordinary people remembered nearly 2 decades of uncertainty. Villages burned, trade disrupted, taxes unpredictable, and law almost non-existent. Peasants who had survived by hiding or fleeing carried scars and stories of Stephen's indecision. Henry II's reforms offered relief, but the memory of chaos lingered. It shaped expectations of kingship for generations. People learned that a monarch's presence was essential, that law and order required enforcement, and that compromise alone could not sustain a kingdom. Stephen's failures became the contrast by which every future king would be judged. His reign was a cautionary tale embedded in the culture of governance, reminding nobles and commoners alike that authority must be visible, decisive, and enforced. This collective memory influenced behavior, loyalty, and obedience, long after Stephen's crown had passed to Henry. Stephen's anarchy taught the nobility painful lessons. Under Stephen, barons acted independently, built private castles, and ignored royal authority when convenient. They experienced temporary gains but also uncertainty, shifting alliances, and devastating consequences when loyalty was misjudged. Henry II's reforms demonstrated the cost of defiance and the benefits of alignment. Nobles who had gained under Stephen's indecision found themselves constrained, disciplined, and accountable. Those who resisted faced confiscation of lands or imprisonment. The lessons were clear. Loyalty to the crown was not negotiable. Authority flowed from the top, and rebellion was dangerous. Stephen's failures, ironically, shaped the behavior of England's ruling class for generations. Nobles learned to respect centralized authority, and their experience under the anarchy informed their decisions under Henry II and subsequent kings. The collapse of law during Stephen's reign revealed its fragility. Courts were ignored, barons ruled by force, and ordinary people had no protection. Henry II made law the foundation of royal authority. Judges traveled the kingdom, disputes were standardized under royal oversight, and consistent enforcement became a visible demonstration of power. Stephen's failure to enforce justice had taught Henry a critical lesson. Authority without law is weak. A functioning legal system reassured the populace, constrained barons, and strengthened the monarchy. This period marked a turning point in England's governance. Law was no longer symbolic. It became practical, predictable, and enforceable, the backbone of centralized power. Stephen's reign had shown the cost of neglect, and Henry converted that lesson into one of the most enduring reforms in English history. Beyond law and governance, England's social fabric recovered. Stephen's civil war had disrupted communities. Villages were abandoned, harvests lost, and daily life uncertain. Ordinary people had lived under constant threat of violence and lawlessness. Henry II's reforms restored predictability. Security returned to the countryside. Farmers could tend crops. Merchants could trade safely. Nobles learned to respect the crown, ensuring order at every level of society. The anarchy had revealed the consequences of weak leadership. Stephen's indecision prolonged suffering and eroded trust. Henry applied those lessons systematically. The kingdom became cohesive again. The recovery of social stability was not immediate, but the contrast to Stephen's chaotic reign was stark. England now had functioning institutions, secure communities, and the expectation that order would persist. Stephen's reign may have been a failure, but it left a lasting mark on England. The anarchy exposed vulnerabilities. Fragmented authority, independent castles, inconsistent law, unreliable taxes, and military weakness. It highlighted the costs of indecision, compromise, and lack of enforcement. Henry II learned every lesson. He rebuilt authority, centralized power, enforced law, standardized taxation, disciplined the military, and partnered with the church. Stephen's mistakes became a roadmap for governance. The long-term lesson was clear. A kingdom cannot survive on symbolism alone. Authority must be visible, enforceable, and systematic. Stephen failed and England suffered. Henry succeeded and England prospered. Stephen's legacy is paradoxical, a reign of failure that indirectly strengthened the monarchy. The anarchy shaped political, social, and economic systems for generations, embedding the consequences of weak rule in England's collective memory. Stephen's reign had revealed the fragility of medieval governance. Authority fractured under indecision, law collapsed under neglect, and the nobility acted independently when power was ambiguous. Henry II used Stephen's failures as a blueprint. Castles were centralized, justice enforced, taxation standardized, and the military disciplined. The church became a partner rather than a challenge. England now functioned as a unified state. Ordinary people experienced stability, trade resumed, and the crown's authority became predictable and enforceable. The contrast was stark. Stephen had maintained a crown but lost control. Henry inherited not just a kingdom, but a lesson in how to consolidate authority, enforce law, and rebuild a fractured society. The anarchy's chaos had shown what happens when authority is diffuse and indecisive. Henry turned that lesson into a durable system that would influence English governance for generations. Stephen's indecision taught more than structural lessons. It exposed the psychology of power. Barons and nobles learned to test limits. Peasants lived in fear. Authority without enforcement became negotiable. Stephen's mercy and compromise, though well-intentioned, encouraged opportunism and rebellion. Henry understood that authority must be visible, respected, and feared when necessary. Loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be maintained through consequences and incentives. The kingdom's social psychology shifted. People knew that defiance would not be tolerated, that law was consistent, and that the crown's presence mattered. Stephen's failures thus created a template for understanding governance beyond mere structures. Leadership is as much about perception and consistency as it is about force or law. Henry applied these insights methodically. Stephen's reign had allowed institutions to weaken. Courts were ignored, tax systems fragmented, and castles operated independently of the crown. Henry II rebuilt every institution with Stephen's failures in mind. Courts became consistent, enforceable, and predictable. Taxes were standardized and collected efficiently. Military service was disciplined and accountable. Castles and fortifications were under direct oversight. The kingdom no longer relied on personal relationships or temporary alliances to function. Institutions became the backbone of governance. Ordinary people, nobles, and clergy all understood their roles, and authority flowed predictably from the crown. Stephen's reign was crucial in this transformation. By demonstrating the consequences of weak institutions, he indirectly guided the creation of stronger ones. His failures highlighted vulnerabilities that Henry systematically addressed, creating the centralized English state that would endure for centuries. The anarchy left more than political lessons. It shaped culture and collective memory. Stories of chaos, famine, and uncertainty circulated widely. Peasants remembered burned villages. Nobles remembered betrayal and opportunism. Chroniclers documented broken laws, sieges, and shifting alliances. This shared memory influenced behavior for decades. People learned the value of order, the importance of law, and the necessity of a strong crown. Stephen's failures created cautionary examples, teaching that indecision and compromise in leadership could be disastrous. Henry II's reforms drew directly from this cultural memory. The monarchy became disciplined, law consistent, and authority respected. The lessons of the anarchy were embedded in societal expectations of governance. Stephen may have failed as a king, but his reign became a formative chapter in the cultural understanding of authority, order, and responsibility. By 1170, the lessons of Stephen's anarchy were fully realized. Henry II had transformed England into a unified, centralized, and functioning kingdom. Law was enforced, castles were controlled, taxes standardized, and military power disciplined. The church supported the crown. Ordinary people experienced security. Nobles understood limits. Authority was tangible and respected. Stephen's failures had made all of this possible indirectly. They highlighted every weakness, every vulnerability, and every danger of indecision. Henry did not ignore the past. He learned from it. The anarchy became a guide, shaping not only Henry's reign but the expectations and behavior of generations of English rulers. Stephen's legacy was paradoxical. He failed spectacularly, yet that failure laid the foundation for a stronger monarchy and a more resilient England. The lessons of the anarchy would echo for centuries, a reminder of what happens when authority falters and how careful governance can restore order. Stephen of Blois is often remembered as indecisive, chaotic, and ineffective, but historians increasingly recognize his reign for its unintended influence on England's development. The 19 years of the anarchy were catastrophic, yet they exposed vulnerabilities in monarchy, law, and governance that might otherwise have remained hidden. Stephen's mistakes, tolerating rogue barons, allowing uncontrolled castle building, and failing to enforce law, demonstrated the consequences of weak central authority. Every failure was a lesson in disguise, and Henry II's reforms directly addressed them. In many ways, Stephen's reign acted as a stress test for England. It revealed how fragile institutions could be, and how ordinary people, nobles, and clergy reacted when authority faltered. His legacy, therefore, is not only a tale of failure, but also a catalyst for a stronger, centralized kingdom. The anarchy was more than a political crisis. It was a lesson in governance. Stephen's reign exposed the dangers of compromise without enforcement. Nobles acted opportunistically. Castles multiplied unchecked. Law collapsed, and ordinary people suffered. Henry II applied these lessons methodically. Castles were controlled, law enforced, taxation standardized, and the military disciplined. Authority was centralized, visible, and predictable. Stephen's failures became a practical curriculum for governance. Every misstep highlighted a vulnerability: unchecked noble power, inconsistent justice, and fragile infrastructure. The kingdom learned from these errors. England's institutions became more resilient, and societal expectations of monarchy shifted permanently. The anarchy demonstrated that failure can be instructive. Stephen's reign, though chaotic, provided the blueprint for a monarchy capable of sustaining order, authority, and prosperity. Stephen's indecision reshaped the behavior of England's nobles. Under the anarchy, barons acted independently, built private fortresses, and switched loyalties at will. They tested boundaries, taking advantage of the crown's weakness. Temporary gains came with long-term instability. Henry II used these lessons to enforce discipline. Loyalty became enforceable rather than voluntary. Rebellion carried consequences. Barons learned to respect central authority, understanding that alignment with the crown ensured stability and survival. Stephen's failures indirectly trained the nobility. They became accustomed to centralized governance, predictable justice, and the limits of power. The long-term effect was profound. English noble culture shifted. The crown became the ultimate arbiter, and the memory of Stephen's mismanagement encouraged obedience, caution, and alignment with royal policy. The anarchy, in short, redefined the social contract between monarch and nobility. Stephen's reign had left legal and administrative systems in disarray. Local courts were ignored. Justice was uneven. Taxes were inconsistent. Administrative authority fractured. Henry II rebuilt these systems using Stephen's failures as a guide. Royal courts traveled the country, judges applied standardized law, and officials collected taxes predictably. Administrative power flowed from the crown, ensuring consistency across England. Stephen's collapse of institutions highlighted the dangers of neglect and compromise. Henry recognized that law and administration were not optional. They were essential tools of governance. The result was lasting stability. Institutions were no longer dependent on individual nobles or temporary alliances. Ordinary people knew the law would protect them. Nobles knew the crown's authority was enforceable. Stephen's failures created a roadmap for institutional reform, shaping English governance for centuries. Stephen's reign ended in 1154, and yet its influence persisted far beyond his death. The anarchy left England fragile, fragmented, and traumatized. But it also provided clear lessons. Authority must be enforced, law must be predictable, loyalty cannot be assumed, and institutions must be resilient. Henry II internalized these lessons, rebuilding the monarchy with precision. The crown became centralized. Castles, courts, taxes, the military, and the church were aligned. Ordinary people regained security, and nobles learned limits. Authority was visible, tangible, and respected. Stephen's failure was paradoxically constructive. By revealing the weaknesses of monarchy, he shaped the reforms that would define English governance for generations. The chaos of the anarchy ensured that subsequent rulers understood the consequences of indecision and compromise. Stephen's reign reminds us that failure, when studied and corrected, can lay the foundation for enduring success. History learned from him, and England became stronger because of it. Stephen of Blois is often remembered as a weak king, yet his reign left an enduring legacy, one forged through failure. The anarchy exposed the consequences of indecision. Barons acting independently, castles uncontrolled, law ignored, and ordinary people suffering. England's society, economy, and governance all faltered, yet these failures became instructive. Henry II inherited a kingdom that was vulnerable and fragmented. Every mistake Stephen made became a lesson: what to avoid, what to enforce, and what to centralize. Stephen's reign was a cautionary tale turned blueprint. His inability to consolidate power paradoxically provided the necessary insight for building a stronger monarchy. His legacy is complex, not one of triumph, but of influence. England's later stability and institutional strength owe much to the hard lessons Stephen's mismanagement imparted. Politically, Stephen's reign revealed that compromise alone could not sustain authority. During the anarchy, he negotiated constantly, hoping to placate opposing barons and maintain temporary peace. Yet his indecision emboldened rebellion. Authority without enforcement proved ineffective. Henry II understood that political survival required clear boundaries. Loyalty had to be incentivized, disloyalty punished, and authority centralized. Castles were controlled, taxes enforced, and military service disciplined. Stephen's political failures shaped England's expectations. Nobles learned that opportunism carried consequences. Monarchs learned that compromise without enforcement risked collapse. Stephen's mismanagement inadvertently created a template for strong governance. His reign taught lessons about balance. Mercy must be tempered by authority, negotiation must be backed by enforcement, and the crown must maintain visible control. Stephen's anarchy left social and economic scars. Villages were burned, trade disrupted, and peasants suffered under lawless barons. Markets stagnated, roads fell into disrepair, and ordinary life was precarious. Henry II rebuilt these foundations systematically. Roads and bridges were repaired, markets reopened, trade resumed. Peasants could farm safely, merchants could plan long-term, and nobles could rely on consistent taxation and royal support. Stephen's failures revealed that governance is inseparable from social stability and economic infrastructure. Weak authority leads not only to political collapse, but to human suffering and stagnation. Henry's reforms directly addressed these vulnerabilities. The anarchy became a cautionary guide, illustrating the practical consequences of indecision on everyday life. England's recovery under Henry demonstrates that lessons from chaos can create lasting prosperity. Stephen's inability to control the military revealed vulnerabilities in defense and strategic planning. Barons raised troops independently, castles became fortified power bases, and rebellions were frequent. England lacked a cohesive military strategy, leaving ordinary people and the crown vulnerable. Henry II reorganized the military entirely. Troop levies were disciplined and predictable. Castles were brought under royal control. Standing forces could respond to unrest swiftly. Rebellion became risky, and the crown's authority was tangible. Stephen's reign showed that weak enforcement of military power destabilizes a kingdom. Henry's reforms created a system that not only defended the crown, but enforced social and political stability. The lessons of the anarchy in military terms became permanent. Authority must be backed by force, strategy, and central oversight, ensuring a kingdom's survival and prosperity. Stephen's reign, though chaotic, left a powerful historical lesson. The anarchy demonstrated that indecision, compromise without enforcement, and fragmented authority can destabilize a kingdom. Castles multiplied unchecked, law collapsed, and ordinary people suffered. Henry II internalized these lessons. He rebuilt England systematically, centralizing authority, enforcing law, controlling castles, disciplining the military, standardizing taxation, and aligning the church. Stephen's failures became the blueprint for effective governance. The enduring lesson is clear. Failure, when observed and corrected, can shape a stronger future. Stephen's 19 years of chaos did not vanish from memory. They informed institutional, political, and social reforms that stabilized England for generations. Though he is remembered as weak, Stephen's unintended contribution was monumental. The anarchy became the crucible from which England's monarchy emerged stronger, more disciplined, and resilient. His reign remains a reminder that even failure can leave a legacy. Stephen's anarchy left a mark on England's collective memory. Villages burned, trade halted, law collapsed, and ordinary people endured hardship. Chroniclers wrote of chaos and shifting loyalties. Tales of suffering and disorder circulated widely, becoming part of England's cultural consciousness. These stories shaped expectations of monarchy for generations. People learned that strong, centralized authority was not optional. It was essential. Stephen's reign became the reference point for instability, teaching both rulers and subjects that indecision had tangible consequences. Henry II leveraged this collective memory. By rebuilding authority, law, and infrastructure, he restored stability while contrasting his reign against Stephen's failures. The anarchy became a benchmark, a period to remember, to learn from, and to avoid repeating. Stephen's failure thus transcended politics. It shaped culture, perception, and behavior, embedding lessons about order, loyalty, and governance deeply into society. Stephen's reign revealed weaknesses in England's institutions. Courts were inconsistent, taxation unreliable, and castles operated independently of the crown. Henry II systematically addressed these gaps. Judges traveled regularly. Tax collection became predictable. Military obligations were enforced. Castles were placed under royal oversight. Even the church aligned with the crown. Stephen's failures highlighted the importance of resilient institutions. Without them, authority falters, law collapses, and ordinary people suffer. Henry's reforms ensured that institutions were not dependent on personalities but on consistent systems. The lessons of the anarchy transformed governance. Institutions became the backbone of centralized authority, capable of enforcing law, collecting revenue, and maintaining security. Stephen's mismanagement was a blueprint for improvement, shaping a system that endured long beyond Henry's reign. Stephen's reign taught the nobility about limits and consequences. During the anarchy, barons acted independently, shifting loyalties, building private fortresses, and exploiting the crown's weakness. Temporary gains came at the cost of chaos and uncertainty. Henry II applied these lessons decisively. Loyalty became enforceable. Disobedience had consequences. Castles, taxation, and military service were centralized. Nobles learned that defiance was risky and alignment with the crown ensured survival. Stephen's failures indirectly trained the nobility, shaping their behavior for generations. The crown's authority became predictable, enforceable, and respected. Social hierarchy stabilized, and the nobility adapted to functioning within a centralized state rather than exploiting gaps in authority. The anarchy thus reshaped England's political culture. Nobles internalized lessons about obedience, loyalty, and the risks of opportunism, ensuring a stronger, more disciplined monarchy in the years that followed. Stephen's mismanagement left law and order fractured. Courts were ignored, barons ruled by force, and ordinary people lived in fear. Henry II transformed the legal and enforcement systems. Judges traveled the countryside, legal decisions were standardized, and castles were placed under royal oversight. Military forces could respond quickly to unrest. The result was security and predictability. Ordinary people could farm, trade, and live with confidence. Nobles understood that the crown's authority was enforceable. Law became the foundation of governance rather than a tool for compromise. Stephen's reign had shown the cost of weak enforcement. Henry's reforms made authority tangible, law consistent, and rebellion risky. England's institutions now functioned as intended, demonstrating the importance of law, order, and centralized enforcement in sustaining monarchy and societal stability. Stephen's anarchy left a paradoxical legacy. On the surface, it was a reign of chaos, indecision, and suffering. Barons acted independently, law was ignored, castles were uncontrolled, and ordinary people endured hardship. Yet these failures became instructional. Henry II learned from every weakness. Centralizing authority, enforcing law, standardizing taxation, disciplining the military, and aligning the church with the crown. Every misstep Stephen made became a blueprint for reform. The anarchy demonstrated that failure can be as influential as success. Stephen's reign shaped English governance, noble behavior, and societal expectations. His mistakes ensured that subsequent rulers would prioritize enforcement, predictability, and centralization. Stephen's unintended contribution was monumental, a chaotic reign that indirectly strengthened the monarchy and left lessons for generations. The anarchy became a living guide, proving that even failure can create enduring institutional and societal change. By the late 1160s, Henry II had fully centralized authority, a transformation made possible by lessons learned from Stephen's failures. Under Stephen, the monarchy had been symbolic. Castles operated independently, barons ignored law, and authority was inconsistent. The crown was reactive, not directive. Henry reversed this systematically. Castles were placed under royal control. Taxes were collected reliably. Judges traveled regularly, enforcing standardized law. Military forces were disciplined and deployable. Even the church aligned with the crown. Stephen's reign had revealed the dangers of decentralization. Henry's reforms addressed them all, creating a cohesive, functioning state. Authority was visible, enforceable, and consistent. Ordinary people regained security, trade flourished, and nobles understood limits. The anarchy's chaos had provided the blueprint. Without Stephen's failures, Henry may not have understood the necessity of centralization, enforcement, and visible authority. England's monarchy emerged stronger because of a reign often dismissed as weak. Stephen's reign exposed the dangers of a fragmented military. Armies answered to local lords, castles became private strongholds, and rebellion was frequent. England lacked coherent defense or enforcement. Henry II rebuilt the military systematically. Barons provided troops predictably. Castles were under royal oversight. Standing forces could respond quickly to rebellion or invasion. Rebellion became risky, loyalty rewarded. The difference was stark. Where Stephen had tolerated chaos, Henry enforced discipline. Ordinary people felt safer. Nobles learned to respect central authority. Stephen's failures provided the lesson. Authority without enforcement is meaningless. Military strength is not just about defense. It is a tool to uphold law, ensure compliance, and stabilize society. By reorganizing the military, Henry transformed England from a fragmented kingdom into a secure, disciplined, and unified state, ensuring that the mistakes of the anarchy would not be repeated. Stephen's reign had shown the fragility of law in England. Courts were ignored, barons ruled by force, and ordinary people had little protection. Henry II rebuilt legal systems comprehensively. Judges traveled the countryside, disputes were standardized under royal oversight, and enforcement was consistent. Castles and troops supported the judicial process. Law became a visible tool of authority, not an optional practice. Ordinary people could live and work with confidence. Nobles understood limits and the consequences of defiance. Stephen's failures highlighted the consequences of neglecting law. Henry's reforms made it a central pillar of governance, ensuring stability, predictability, and compliance across England. The anarchy had been destructive, but it provided the blueprint. England emerged stronger, demonstrating that legal and institutional reforms are essential for a functioning, centralized monarchy. Stephen's anarchy had left England's economy in chaos. Trade was disrupted, markets inactive, roads dangerous, and peasants' livelihoods uncertain. Henry II applied the lessons of mismanagement to rebuild economic stability. Roads and bridges were repaired, towns revived, markets reopened. Tax collection was standardized, providing predictability for nobles, merchants, and peasants alike. Ordinary people could farm safely. Merchants could plan and trade confidently. Nobles received steady revenue. England's wealth returned, funding royal administration, defense, and public works. Stephen's failures had revealed the fragility of economic infrastructure in the absence of central authority. Henry's reforms transformed England into a predictable and prosperous kingdom, demonstrating that economic recovery is inseparable from governance, law, and enforcement. The kingdom was no longer at the mercy of local barons. Authority and infrastructure ensured long-term stability and prosperity. Stephen's reign occasionally clashed with the church, undermining his legitimacy and complicating governance. Bishops and abbots sometimes acted independently or opposed royal authority. Henry II approached religion strategically. He recognized the church's influence but ensured its loyalty aligned with the crown. Bishops and abbots became partners in governance, supporting law enforcement, taxation, and social stability. This alignment reinforced centralized authority. Religious institutions, previously unpredictable, now contributed to law, order, and legitimacy. Ordinary people saw the crown and church working in tandem, building trust and reinforcing obedience. Stephen's failures demonstrated the consequences of alienating powerful institutions. Henry's reforms turned that lesson into a strength. Authority, law, military, economy, and religion now worked together in a coordinated system, creating a stable, resilient kingdom. The anarchy had revealed weaknesses. Henry fixed them all, shaping England into a model of centralized medieval governance. Stephen's reign, often remembered for chaos, offers profound lessons about leadership and governance. During the anarchy, authority fractured, castles were independent, law was inconsistent, and ordinary people suffered. Stephen's indecision allowed nobles to exploit gaps, creating temporary gains but long-term instability. His compromises were well-intentioned, yet ineffective. Henry II inherited a kingdom weakened by these failures. He studied Stephen's mistakes carefully, applying lessons to centralize authority, enforce law, regulate taxation, control castles, discipline the military, and align with the church. Stephen's failures, paradoxically, became instructional. Without them, Henry might not have understood the vulnerabilities that threatened the crown. England emerged stronger, safer, and more unified because of the chaos Stephen left behind. The legacy is complex, a reign of failure that indirectly forged the foundations of a stronger monarchy, illustrating that mistakes, when analyzed and corrected, can shape long-term stability. Stephen's anarchy taught England's rulers and people about the importance of governance. Weak central authority during his reign allowed barons to act independently. Castles multiplied unchecked. Law was inconsistent, and ordinary people suffered. Stephen's failures highlighted that symbolic authority is insufficient without enforcement. Henry II applied these lessons meticulously. Centralized courts, standardized taxation, controlled castles, disciplined military, and cooperation with the church transformed governance. Authority became enforceable and predictable. Nobles understood limits. Ordinary people experienced security. The anarchy became a case study embedded in English governance. It shaped how subsequent kings would balance power, enforce law, and maintain loyalty. Stephen's reign is remembered not for triumph, but for illustrating the critical importance of centralized, structured, and enforced governance. Even failure, when analyzed, can instruct. Stephen's chaotic rule became the foundation upon which effective monarchy was rebuilt. Stephen's reign left a profound social impact. Villages were burned, trade disrupted, and ordinary people lived in fear. Peasants were forced to navigate lawless lands while nobles exploited instability. Communities were fractured, and the daily rhythms of life were unpredictable. Henry II's reforms restored stability. Roads and bridges were repaired, towns revived, and markets reopened. Ordinary people could farm, trade, and live with confidence. Social cohesion returned alongside predictable governance. Stephen's failures exposed the cost of weak authority on society. Without centralized power, law, and enforcement, social order disintegrates. Henry's reforms, built on these lessons, ensured that England's population could live under predictable structures, demonstrating the connection between governance and social stability. The Anarchy reminds us that political failure has deep human consequences. Beyond castles and law, it affected communities, livelihoods, and trust, lessons Henry II internalized for lasting stability. The chaos of Stephen's reign left a cultural imprint. Chroniclers documented sieges, shifting alliances, lawlessness, and famine. Stories of the Anarchy circulated for generations, creating a shared understanding of the consequences of weak leadership. Nobles and ordinary people internalized these lessons. Indecision and compromise without enforcement led to suffering. Henry II leveraged this collective memory to consolidate power. By centralizing authority and enforcing law, he contrasted order against Stephen's chaos, reinforcing legitimacy. Stephen's reign became a cautionary tale embedded in England's culture. It shaped expectations of monarchy, behavior of nobles, and societal understanding of authority. The Anarchy taught that stability is precious, law is essential, and authority must be visible and enforceable. The cultural memory of failure ensured that future rulers understood the stakes, embedding lessons from Stephen's mismanagement into the very fabric of governance and society. The ultimate legacy of Stephen's reign is paradoxical. England's monarchy emerged stronger because of his failures. The Anarchy revealed vulnerabilities in authority, law, military power, economic stability, and church relations. Stephen's compromises, indecision, and inability to enforce order created chaos, but these failures became the blueprint for reform. Henry II applied these lessons meticulously. Centralization, consistent law, controlled castles, disciplined military, standardized taxation, and church alignment transformed the kingdom. Ordinary people experienced security, nobles learned limits. England became unified, predictable, and resilient. Stephen's reign demonstrates that even catastrophic failure can have lasting influence. His mistakes illuminated weaknesses, and the subsequent corrections created institutions and systems that endured for centuries. The Anarchy remains a reminder that leadership requires decisiveness, enforcement, and visible authority. Lessons embedded in England's monarchy, culture, and governance long after Stephen's crown passed to Henry II. Stephen's Anarchy was more than a period of political instability. It was a crucible that tested the English monarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England endured lawlessness, independent castles, and unpredictable barons. Ordinary people suffered, trade was disrupted, and governance fractured. Stephen's attempts at compromise, though well-intentioned, failed to maintain authority. Yet this chaos provided clarity. Henry II inherited not just a throne, but a blueprint of vulnerabilities. Every failure, every unchecked baron, burned village, and abandoned castle highlighted weaknesses that required systematic reform. Stephen's reign became a reference point, a cautionary tale, and an instructional case in governance. Historians now see the Anarchy as a pivotal episode, one that illuminated the need for centralization, law enforcement, and predictable leadership. Without Stephen's failures, the lessons that enabled England to emerge stronger may not have been as apparent. His reign, chaotic though it was, indirectly paved the way for a disciplined and enduring monarchy. Stephen's reign exposed the fragility of England's institutions. Courts were ignored, castles operated independently, taxes were irregular, and military obligations were inconsistent. Henry II transformed these systems systematically. Judges traveled the country, legal decisions were enforced uniformly, castles were under central oversight, taxation became predictable, and the military was disciplined. Even the church was aligned with the crown, reinforcing authority across society. Stephen's failures provided a roadmap. They highlighted what needed correction and what vulnerabilities could destabilize the kingdom. By studying his mistakes, Henry created resilient institutions that endured for centuries. The Anarchy demonstrated that strong institutions are the backbone of a functioning monarchy. Authority without systems fails. Law without enforcement is meaningless. Military power without central control is unstable. Stephen's mismanagement revealed these truths. England's governance after the anarchy was stronger because Stephen inadvertently provided a comprehensive blueprint for institutional reform. Stephen's anarchy left lasting social scars. Villages were abandoned, trade routes unsafe, and peasants lived in fear. Communities fractured and trust in leadership eroded. Henry II's reforms rebuilt social resilience. Roads and bridges were repaired, towns revived, markets reopened, and ordinary people could live with confidence. Law was enforced consistently. Nobles learned limits. Communities could thrive under predictable governance. Stephen's reign revealed how fragile social order becomes when authority is weak. His failures underscored the importance of predictability, law, and protection for ordinary people. The recovery under Henry II was remarkable. Social cohesion returned, commerce resumed, and communities adapted to functioning within a stronger, centralized monarchy. Stephen's chaos, in hindsight, emphasized that governance and social stability are inseparable, that ordinary people rely on consistent authority for security and prosperity. The anarchy left a lasting imprint on England's cultural and historical memory. Chroniclers documented burned villages, sieges, shifting alliances, and lawlessness. These stories circulated, shaping how both nobles and commoners understood the consequences of weak leadership. Stephen's reign became a cautionary tale, a measure against which future monarchs would be judged. Henry II leveraged this collective memory to reinforce central authority. By contrasting order against chaos, he secured legitimacy and public trust. The anarchy became a shared cultural lesson. Stability is valuable, law is essential, and visible authority is critical. Stephen's failures shaped behavior for generations. Nobles internalized limits, peasants learned the value of predictability, and kings understood the necessity of enforcement. His reign, though chaotic, provided a cultural and historical framework for governance that endured long after his death. By 1170, the lessons of Stephen's reign had fully informed Henry II's governance. Authority was centralized, castles were controlled, law was enforced, taxes were predictable, military forces were disciplined. Even the church aligned with the crown. Ordinary people experienced security, nobles understood limits. England functioned as a unified, resilient kingdom. Stephen's failures had been instructive. Each misstep became a lesson in what not to do: compromise without enforcement, tolerating rogue barons, neglecting law, or failing to protect ordinary people. Henry internalized these lessons, creating a system capable of enduring future crises. The anarchy's chaos ensured that England's institutions, society, and monarchy became stronger, more predictable, and more resilient. Stephen's reign may have been turbulent, but it provided the foundation for stability, prosperity, and centralized authority, lessons that would echo through centuries of English governance. Stephen's reign is remembered as chaotic, indecisive, and often ineffective. Yet paradoxically, that very chaos shaped the future of the English monarchy. The anarchy exposed every vulnerability: independent castles, lawlessness, rebellious barons, disrupted trade, and the suffering of ordinary people. Every failure was a lesson in disguise. Stephen's compromises and indecision created gaps that demanded correction. Henry II inherited not just a kingdom, but a detailed map of weaknesses. He centralized authority, enforced law, regulated taxation, disciplined the military, and aligned the church. England became stronger, more predictable, and resilient because Stephen's failures had revealed exactly what needed fixing. The paradox is clear. A reign of failure produced a reign of reform. Stephen's mistakes became the blueprint for order, demonstrating that historical significance is not always measured in success, but in influence. Stephen's reign highlighted the fragility of institutions. Courts were ignored, castles operated independently, taxes were irregular, and military obligations were inconsistent. Henry II applied the lessons systematically. Courts traveled the kingdom, legal decisions were standardized, taxes predictable, and castles under royal oversight. Military forces were disciplined, and the church supported centralized authority. Stephen's failures were instrumental in showing what could collapse without strong enforcement. His reign revealed that authority requires structure. Institutions had to be resilient, predictable, and capable of enforcing law. England's governance emerged stronger because the anarchy had exposed vulnerabilities. Lessons from chaos shaped systems that would endure for centuries, providing stability for nobles, clergy, and ordinary people alike. Stephen's mismanagement became a roadmap. His failures, though destructive, left lasting institutional wisdom that defined English monarchy long after his death. The anarchy disrupted the economy and fractured society. Villages burned, roads were unsafe, markets inactive, and ordinary people lived in fear. Henry II rebuilt infrastructure, trade networks, and social order. Roads and bridges were repaired. Markets revived. Peasants could farm safely. Merchants could trade confidently. Nobles received predictable revenue. Communities thrived again. Stephen's failures exposed the fragility of society under weak governance. Without predictable authority, social cohesion and economic stability crumble. By contrast, Henry's reforms demonstrated that governance, law, and enforcement are inseparable from prosperity. The lessons of Stephen's reign directly influenced the creation of a resilient social and economic framework. The kingdom could now withstand challenges that would have toppled it during the anarchy. Stephen's chaotic reign, paradoxically, illuminated the path to stability, prosperity, and institutional resilience. Stephen's reign exposed the dangers of a fragmented military. Armies answered to local lords, castles became private strongholds, and rebellions were frequent. England lacked strategic coordination and predictability. Henry II reorganized the military entirely. Troop levies became predictable. Castles came under royal control. Standing forces could respond quickly to threats. Rebellion became risky. Loyalty was rewarded. Stephen's failures revealed that weak enforcement of military power destabilizes society. Authority must be backed by tangible force, visible enforcement, and strategic oversight. The lessons extended beyond defense. Military discipline reinforced law, secured trade, and protected ordinary people. England transitioned from fragmented chaos to coordinated security. Stephen's reign, though disastrous, provided the blueprint for a kingdom capable of maintaining order through centralized, disciplined military power. Stephen's reign sometimes clashed with the church, weakening his legitimacy. Bishops and abbots acted independently, complicating governance. Henry II learned from these failures. He aligned the church with the crown, ensuring religious authority reinforced royal authority. Bishops became partners in governance, supporting law, taxation, and social stability. The anarchy revealed that religious institutions could destabilize a kingdom if ignored or alienated. Henry turned that lesson into strength, integrating the church into the machinery of governance while maintaining royal authority. Stephen's mistakes highlighted the necessity of collaboration between secular and spiritual power. The crown's legitimacy and societal stability now depended on predictable law, disciplined enforcement, and strategic alliances with religious institutions. England emerged with a monarchy that was both politically and spiritually reinforced, demonstrating that the lessons of chaos can shape more enduring, balanced authority. Stephen's reign taught enduring lessons in leadership, governance, and societal stability. Indecision and compromise without enforcement led to chaos. Weak central authority fragmented power. Ordinary people suffered, trade faltered, law collapsed, and barons acted independently. Henry II internalized these lessons. Centralization, consistent law, controlled castles, disciplined military, predictable taxation, and church alignment created a resilient monarchy. Authority became tangible and respected. Ordinary people experienced security, and nobles understood limits. The long-term lesson: failure can instruct. Stephen's reign indirectly strengthened the monarchy. By exposing weaknesses, the anarchy provided a roadmap for reform. England emerged stronger, more unified, and capable of withstanding future crises. Stephen's paradoxical legacy is clear. Failure shaped long-term success. His chaotic reign became a crucible in which the foundations of centralized, enforceable, and enduring authority were forged. Historians today view Stephen's reign through a nuanced lens. He was not a visionary monarch, nor did he succeed in controlling his kingdom effectively. Yet his reign became a critical turning point. The anarchy revealed vulnerabilities that, left unexposed, could have persisted for decades. Henry II applied these lessons with precision, creating a monarchy that was disciplined, centralized, and resilient. Law, military power, taxation, and church relations were coordinated. Social and economic stability returned. The contrast between Stephen and Henry is stark. Failure highlighted the path to success. Stephen's reign demonstrates that historical significance is not only measured by success, but by the lessons a period provides. Chaos can instruct, instability can inform, and failure can catalyze enduring reforms. The anarchy teaches a universal lesson about authority. Visibility, enforcement, and consistency matter more than symbolism or compromise. Stephen's reign demonstrated that indecision weakens a kingdom. Barons exploited gaps, law collapsed, and ordinary people suffered. Authority without enforcement is meaningless. Henry II corrected every flaw Stephen had exposed. Authority became tangible, law predictable, and rebellion risky. Castles, military forces, taxation, and the church were aligned. England became unified, stable, and resilient. The enduring lesson is clear. Leadership requires decisiveness, visibility, and enforceable systems. Stephen's reign, though often dismissed as weak, indirectly shaped the principles that defined English governance for centuries. Chaos revealed vulnerabilities. Reform corrected them. England's monarchy became stronger because of failure, demonstrating that lessons learned in turmoil can have lasting consequences. Stephen's legacy is paradoxical, a reign of failure that created lasting influence. The anarchy left England fractured, lawless, and chaotic. Ordinary people suffered. Barons acted independently. Trade faltered. Authority was symbolic, not enforceable. Yet these failures became lessons. Henry II learned precisely what needed fixing: law, castles, taxation, military discipline, church alignment, and social stability. By correcting Stephen's missteps, England emerged stronger, more unified, and capable of enduring future crises. Stephen's reign reminds us that failure can shape history as profoundly as success. Chaos can instruct. Instability can inform. Mismanagement can create a blueprint for reform. The anarchy left scars but also a guide. England's monarchy, society, and institutions were strengthened because Stephen's reign revealed vulnerabilities no one else had exposed. Stephen's reign ended in 1154, but its influence echoes across centuries. The anarchy was a period of chaos, indecision, and suffering. Yet its failures illuminated vulnerabilities that, once corrected, forged a stronger, centralized monarchy under Henry II. Castles, law, taxation, military, and church alignment were all reformed. Ordinary people gained security, trade resumed, and nobles learned limits. Stephen's paradoxical legacy is enduring, a king whose failures became the blueprint for long-term success. The lessons of the anarchy about authority, law, governance, social stability, and human resilience remain relevant to this day. History often measures rulers by victories, but sometimes significance lies in the lessons they leave behind. Stephen failed as a king, yet through failure, he helped shape the foundations of a stronger England. Chaos gave birth to order, and a troubled reign became the crucible of lasting legacy. Stephen of Blois was no legendary king. His rule was uncertain, marked by indecision, civil war, and nearly 20 years of chaos, a time history calls the Anarchy. Villages burned, castles sprang up unchecked, the law faltered, and ordinary people suffered. Nobles acted as they pleased, and England teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet within this turmoil lay lessons for the future. Henry II inherited a fractured kingdom, but the disorder revealed exactly what needed fixing. Authority was centralized. Castles came under royal control. Law was enforced. Taxes became predictable. Even the church aligned with the crown. Ordinary lives regained stability, trade resumed, and nobles learned their limits. Stephen's failure became instruction. Leadership demands decisiveness, visibility, and enforceable authority. From the chaos of his reign emerged the foundations of a stronger, unified England, proof that even failure can forge lasting history.